Good morning, everybody. I'm a little early today, so I'm just going to mute myself while everybody signs in.
Good morning.
Tried to unmute, didn't work. All right, as people sign on, I'm just going to go over a couple things. Your exams are graded, so you can look and see how you did. You know what? I didn't look at the stats, so let me pull those up real quick so I can give you information about that. I felt like people did better than last time, but you know, until I look at the stats, I don't know for sure. So let me just pull that up. Okay. So the average was an 86, or actually pretty much an 87. So yes, you all did better than last time. The lowest anyone got was a C minus. So nobody failed or got a D. Let me see, we had 10 people in the A range, 4 people in the B range, 5 people in the C range. So yes, y'all did much better than last time. So go y'all. And that's pretty typical for this class, or honestly any class where I offer trying to think of the word exams. There we go. That people take a minute to get used to my exam style. Hi, you want to come tell them about their exams? No, they don't need to see up your nose. Okay. So it's good that y'all are picking up on it right away. Sometimes it takes people 2 or 3 tests to get it. So our tests from now on will be just like this one, where you'll talk about the clinical choices and the short answer. And then, you know, you'll have something about the disorders that you get to choose for the short essay. So I really like several of you on the essay really just split it up by questions. So that was really easy for me to find everything. So if that's a style that works for you, would recommend. Tomorrow morning, your midterm report should come out. Nothing should be a surprise on those because I just take the grade from Blackboard, so y'all can look at it. But you can, you know, take a glance at that if you want. Trying to think if there's anything else that y'all need to know right now. I don't think so. We'll just keep trucking along throughout the semester. And so now we're going to start, we started with the most common disorders, and now we're going to start to get into the ones that are less common. So they are sort of the unusual ones. Some of these only like 0.5% of the population, or like max 2% of the population will ever experience. Some of them are very, I don't know, it's like hard to wrap your head around some of them. There's the words I'm looking for, because they're so different than what we typically see in our society. And so I just ask that you, again, keep an open mind. You all seem wonderful so far with your writing and your questions. I don't feel like anyone in here is being judgmental. But, you know, these are some of the weirder ones, and it's easy to slip into judging the people who have them. But remember, in the vast majority of these cases, vast majority of these disorders, we're finding out there are biological components. So, again, think about if someone had some sort of genetic disease, right? We wouldn't make fun of them. So, yeah, that's about it. So let me go ahead and look around Simba and get our PowerPoint set up. Just go over here. The joy of having two monitors is I can actually do that more easily. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share screen. I'm literally having to move his little furry tail right now. Alrighty. Okay, so here's our PowerPoint for dissociative and somatoform disorders. So I believe your book now actually puts the dissociative disorders with the stuff we covered right before the exam, the stress disorders. And that makes sense. But when I originally started using this book, it did them with the somatoform disorders. And I like this grouping, which is why I've kept it this way. I think it just intuitively makes some sense that these are both things to do with sort of being out of touch with reality. So I think that these are a good pairing. It also was, one less set of disorders for you all to have to know for exam 2. So that's another reason why I sort of shift these. Make my camera up a little bit so you can see the top of my head. All right. Alrighty. So these disorders we're going to talk about, the dissociative and somatic disorders, have a lot in common. One is that both may occur in response to severe stress. So, if you're not having a post-traumatic stress reaction, it's not actually a traumatic event. This can still happen. These can happen in response to a traumatic event as well. Both have traditionally been viewed as a means of escape from the stress. Again, whether through dissociation or manifesting your stress as physical symptoms. A number of individuals actually have what we call comorbidity. I think I've used that word with you all before. Essentially, that means that they have both. They have both a dissociative disorder and a somatic disorder. And theorists and clinicians often explain and treat the two groups of disorders in similar ways. So again, that's why I keep these lumped, even though your book doesn't really do that anymore. All right, so we're going to start by talking about the dissociative disorders, and these are often the ones that people really enjoy hearing about the most, or one of the top ones, because these are pretty extreme. These are often portrayed in movies because of that. So dissociative disorders are syndromes that feature major losses or changes in memory in particular, but also consciousness and identity. But they don't have physical causes. So it's not like dementia or a neurological disorder. It's not that you got sitcom bumped on the head, right? And then you'll get bumped on the head at the end of the episode and remember everything. Obviously, that's not how head injuries work. Hopefully, everyone knows that by now. This is all psychological, right? This is a reaction to the stress you're going through. They're almost entirely due to psychosocial factors. Memory is the key to our identity. And that sounds weird out of context, but it's true. Memory is the key to our identity. It's the sense of who we are. It's our characteristics. It's our needs, the preferences we have. Those are all in our memory, right? So if I don't remember, right, that the one time I tried X food, I hated it and got really sick, right? Then I'll just keep trying that food and hating it every time, right? Same thing with, thinking about how we've interacted with people in the past, things along those lines. Those really define us. So our recall of the past helps us to react to the present and also guides us towards the future. People sometimes experience major disruptions in their memory where either they don't remember new information. This is typically called anterograde amnesia, and I'll throw that in the chat. That's the inability to make new memories. And sometimes they don't remember old information. And that's what we typically think of when we think of amnesia. And that's actually called retrograde amnesia. So anterograde, new memories, retrograde, you can think of like retro in the past. When this is not caused by a physiological problem like a head trauma, like a stroke, then it is a dissociative disorder. Dissociative disorders occur when there are major disruptions in memory that don't have clear physical causes. One part of the person's memory is typically dissociated or separated from the rest. So essentially that part is broken off, they can't access it, or they have difficulties. And we'll get to some of the theories as to why that is throughout this section of the chapter. So these are the types of dissociative disorders, and we're going to go over these in a lot more detail. Each gets its own slide or three. And it's important to note that dissociative symptoms are often found in the cases of acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. So if we think about things like, intrusive memories or the flashbacks, right? Those are dissociative symptoms sometimes. Flashbacks certainly are. And so when those symptoms occur as part of PTSD, they don't necessarily indicate that the person also has a dissociative disorder. A dissociative disorder is where that dissociation, where that memory issue dominates. So if someone comes to you and they say they have PTSD and you go through all the symptoms and they have the symptoms of dissociation, they have symptoms of, like flat affect and things like that, you don't diagnose them with PTSD and depression and a dissociative disorder unless there's other evidence that warrants it, right? You say, what is the simplest explanation for all of these things? PTSD. However, some research suggests that people with one of these disorders, like PTSD, may be more highly vulnerable to developing a dissociative disorder or another disorder. And certainly that could be true. All right, so these are the types of dissociative disorders. And we will go over each, like I said, in more detail. So dissociative amnesia, people with this disorder are unable to recall important information. Usually that information is of an upsetting nature about their lives. The loss of memory is much more extensive than normal forgetting, and it's not caused by organic factors. Again, it's not from a stroke. It's not from a head trauma. So it's often triggered by a specific upsetting event. It doesn't have to be on the level of a trauma, like a criterion A event for PTSD, but it could be, something like a relationship ending or losing your job or, several of those types of things happening at the same time. There are different types of dissociative amnesia. So localized, also sometimes called circumscribed, is the most common type. And that's the loss of memory, all memory for events occurring within a limited time period. So around a stressful event, typically. So localized or circumscribed is loss of all memory of events occurring within a limited time period. Selective is the loss of memory for some, but not all events occurring within a time period. So you don't not remember. That's a weird double negative. Like you can remember some things about that time, essentially. Generalized is the loss of memory beginning with an event, but then extending back in time. So for some people, this will go back to their earliest memories. And they can actually lose their sense of identity as a result because of everything we just talked about, of how important memory is in identity. And they may fail to recognize family and friends because of this memory loss. And then continuous dissociative amnesia is forgetting both old and new information and events This is pretty rare to have both anterograde and retrograde dissociative amnesia, but it can happen. All forms of this disorder are similar in that amnesia primarily interferes with episodic memory. So episodic memory is our memory of personal material, autobiographical material. So this wouldn't be, learning about the quadratic formula or, World War II. This would be, your childhood memories, or again, things like foods you like or dislike, things along those lines. So semantic memory, which is memory for that stuff we learn in school, memory for that encyclopedic information, usually remains intact. So even though they don't remember what happened to them personally for a certain amount of time, if they learned new things during that amount of time, they will remember those. It's not known how common dissociative amnesia actually is, but we know that rates increase during times of serious threat to health and safety. So for example, we'll probably see rates go up due to COVID and all its extenuating circumstances. All right, so this is the DSM-5 criteria for this disorder. So inability to recall important autobiographical information, usually of a traumatic or stressful nature, and it's beyond ordinary forgetting. It's going to cause significant distress or impairment. And again, it has to be not related to a medical condition. And then one thing I haven't mentioned so far is it can't be due to a substance. It's not like you were so blackout drunk you can't remember what happened. That wouldn't be dissociative amnesia, right? Now, there's also a specifier for dissociative amnesia, which is dissociative amnesia with dissociative fugue. And this used to be its own disorder, just dissociative fugue was its own disorder. And in the DSM-5, they just made it the specifier of dissociative amnesia. So I'm going to read you the sort of clinical definition of this, which is very wordy, but I think is helpful. So apparently purposeful travel or bewildered wandering that is associated with amnesia for identity or for other important autobiographical information. So essentially what that means is people with dissociative amnesia with dissociative fugue not only forget their personal identity and details of the past, but they also up and move, flee to an entirely different location. And sometimes this is the next town over, sometimes this is all the way across the country. This can be brief. They may travel a short distance and not even take on a new identity and just sort of come back fairly quickly. For others, the fugue may be more severe. They may travel thousands of miles, take on a totally new identity, build new relationships, and even display new personality characteristics. It's like they become a different person. As you can see, very low, 0.2% of the population experience dissociative fugue. And it usually follows a severely stressful event, although personal stress can also trigger it. Individuals for this do tend to regain all of their memories and never have a recurrence because fugues tend to end abruptly. It's sort of like the person just sort of snaps out of it. But when people are found before their fugue has ended, therapists may find it necessary to continually remind them of their original identity and location. So if the person doesn't snap out of it themselves, it can be difficult to guide them out of it, if that makes sense. So again, super rare, but very interesting dissociative disorder. All right, dissociative identity disorder, probably people's favorite disorder that I talk about. So this is what we used to call multiple personality disorder. I don't think it's been called that since at least the 90s, might have been even before that. So a person with dissociative identity disorder develops two or more distinct personalities. Sometimes they're called sub-personalities. Sometimes they're called alternate personalities or alters. And each has a unique set of memories, behaviors, thoughts, and emotions. There have been cases where people claim the person, often it's their therapist who claims that they have, 4,000 personalities. That seems really difficult to wrap my head around. Certainly there are cases that have 100, but the most common, the modal version is just two personalities. Best example of this ever in literature or film is Gollum / Smeagol from Lord of the Rings. And his personalities do interact. You see him sort of talking to himself, right? And that is a nice example of DID with two personalities. At any given time, one of those subpersonalities will dominate the person's functioning. Usually one of those personalities is called the primary personality or the host personality, and that one will appear more often than the others. And often that's sort of the original personality. And the transition from one subpersonality to the next is called switching, and it's usually sudden and can be very dramatic. And cases of this disorder have been reported for 3 centuries, so 300 years plus. So certainly this is something that's been around for a while. It's not like a fad or a trend, right? That being said, I always feel it necessary when I talk about this disorder to say there are psychologists out there who do not believe this exists. Those psychologists are skeptical, and they argue that all these personalities are often just suggested by well-meaning therapists who put people who dissociate really easily under hypnosis to try to draw out their alters or their subpersonalities. Here's where I fall on this. So in the course of my 5 years I did clinical work, I had 3 separate supervisors, each of which had been practicing for 20 years or more, each say that during that time they had encountered 1 case of DID. So I think it exists because I don't think any of those people would just make that up for funsies, right? But I think it's super, super rare. And part of the problem that happens with a disorder like this that is so fascinating, that gets a lot of films made about it, is that we'll see an uptick in people claiming they have this, say like after a film like Sybil comes out or Three Faces of Eve. So I think it exists. I just don't think it is as common as these upticks we see afterwards. And there are some cases, high profile cases, where it's less clear whether or not it actually existed. So the case of Sybil, which was a made for TV movie that's actually pretty lengthy. I think it's like 4 or 5 hours. There's actually been a book written about how Sybil never talks about having different personalities until her therapist said she couldn't see her anymore because Sybil's therapist was only going to see people with, at that time, multiple personality disorder. And then all of a sudden Sybil had personalities. I don't ever want to discredit someone, without having interviewed them, but certainly stuff like that makes you question, right? And I think sometimes it's just suggestible people who are coping with their trauma by reacting in this way to people they trust, their therapists. And again, these well-intentioned therapists are not trying to like create alters. They just sort of do based on the techniques they're using. So these are the symptoms from DID. So you've got to have disruption of identity characterized by 2 or more distinct personality states or by an experience of possession. And obviously you would want to separate that from, a religious experience for people where possession may be part of their religious beliefs. Feeling the Holy Spirit, right? Or people who engage in things like seances, right? You want to make sure it's not in that context. And then there's recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events. important personal information and or traumatic events beyond ordinary forgetting, and then significant distress or impairment. And again, you have to make sure this is not just they act differently when they're on substances, right? Or that they have some sort of brain tumor that's causing these issues. So most cases are first diagnosed in late adolescent or early adulthood. But the symptoms often begin in childhood, and one of the common threads is trauma in childhood. So these folks have often experienced horrible, unspeakable childhood abuse, whether it be physical, sexual, some combination thereof. And so almost all patients have a history of that. No, but we also know that can't be the only cause of this disorder, because not every child who's abused develops DID, right? It's believed to represent a mechanism to escape from the impact of trauma. The typical age of onset is before 5. And so again, imagine you're 3-4 years old, you're being horribly abused, you don't understand why, right? The idea is essentially this is the brain's way of trying to protect you by taking those memories of the horrible event and sort of creating this different personality that has those memories, but your main personality doesn't. Women receive this diagnosis 3 times as often as men. Unfortunately, I would say this is because women are much more likely to be abused. So in the past 10, 15 years, we've heard a lot about boys being abused, and I certainly don't want to discredit that. It's very important if we think about things like the Penn State case or the Catholic priests. But young girls are abused often, 7 to 8 times higher rate. And so that's why I think that we see these higher rates, because they're more likely to experience the abuse. So, okay, you've got these subpersonalities. How do they interact? Do they interact? Generally, there's 3 kinds of relationships between the personalities. So there's mutually amnesic, and these are where the subpersonalities have no awareness of each other. Like when each comes out, it's just existing. And when the other one comes out, it's just they have a blank in their memory. Mutually cognizant patterns are where each subpersonality is well aware of the rest. One-way amnesic relationships is the most common, where some personalities are aware of others, but the awareness is not mutual. So you might have one personality that kind of remembers everybody else. And those who are aware, those co-conscious subpersonalities, are essentially quiet observers. And so in the past, I've taught DID in my psych and film class. I'm going to put it back in based on the recommendations I got this past J term. But I've taught it with the movie 3 Faces of Eve. And Eve's case, this is a true case, and I think a very genuine case based on everything I've read about it. But so she had the one-way amnesic relationships. She had, originally, they thought she just had 2 personalities. One would just get sort of blackouts where they would miss memories, and the other one sort of always knew what was going on. And then in the movie, that personality comes in and says, now I'm having the blackouts. And it turns out there's a 3rd personality, hence the 3 Faces of Eve. With that, I typically pair a book by a psychologist whose name is Cameron West, who himself is diagnosed with DID. And his are mutually cognizant. So he can actually sort of like have them interact. He has this, sort of metaphorical room he's constructed called the comfort room, where they can, sit and converse with each other. His case is really interesting and so hard to read about because he was abused multiple times by multiple family members. And so like one of his alters is female because he was abused by an uncle, and it was like his brain couldn't process being abused by another male. And he has some who are kids who are kind of stuck at when they were abused, things along those lines. So how do the subpersonalities differ? They often display dramatically different characteristics, including vital statistics. They can differ, as I just mentioned, in terms of age or sex, also race or family history. And this is, spoilers for a decades-old movie, so I apologize if you've never seen Psycho. But in the movie Psycho, Norman Bates has a subpersonality that is his deceased mother. So obviously a different gender and age than he. They can have different abilities and preferences. Encyclopedic knowledge is less affected in dissociative amnesia or fugue, but in DID, it can actually be disturbed. So one of Eve's personalities just said, like, I just let the other personality do all the schoolwork because I found it boring. So she doesn't really even have like a high school education. And it's not uncommon for different subpersonalities to have different area of expertise or ability. Like some can drive and some can't. Some will speak foreign languages, some will play an instrument. They'll also have, and this is the weirdest part, and this is the part where I think like, this has to be a thing. This has to be biological. There's no other explanation for it. They'll have different physiological responses. So subpersonalities may have physiological differences, such as differences in autonomic nervous system activity, different blood pressure levels, and different allergies. So for example, one of Eve's subpersonalities is allergic to nylon. So like women used to wear nylons, which were like flesh colored tights all the time. And so like whenever that personality comes out, she has to take the nylons that the other personality was wearing off because she's allergic and they itch her. Again, like that doesn't make sense physiologically, right? It's hard to wrap our heads around. But it is the case. They can also have things like different blood pressure levels and things along those lines. So here is an example of one person with DID writing as their different subpersonalities or alters. And so you can see some of them are younger, some of them have more an adult hand. They slant in different ways. And again, one thing I'll say for this is that the cases that are true cases, right, that like this seems to actually be a thing. I'm going to sit down because I have some videos to show y'all. They're not acting. And in fact, these people are often not believing it's happening to them. So in Cameron West's book, at one point, he's taken for inpatient treatment. And at that point, even though it's been years, he's still denying that this is even a thing. He's like, I don't have this, like, no. And so they videotape him and then they show it back. And so he sees himself switching between the alters and it's like revolutionary for him. Because everybody else has seen this, but he's never witnessed it, just experienced it. And so he's like, oh, I do have DID, which again, like to us seems like, well, of course you do, right? But it's hard. It's hard to sort of admit that this is something you have going on. I have two different videos I'm going to show you. Let me do a new screen share here. So the first one is about whether or not this is a real disorder. And then the second one that we'll watch is actually about Eve from the Three Faces of Eve, who was actually a woman named Chris Costner Sizemore. There's a video of her and her alters. But we'll watch this one first.
Dr. Richard Kluft is a psychiatrist who teaches at Temple University Medical School in Philadelphia. Today, doctors prefer the less flashy name dissociative identity disorder, DID, to multiple personality disorder, MPD. They are the same.
What's typical? How many personalities are typical in an MPD case?
In an MPD case in the United States these days, about 16 for women and about 8 for men.
Kluft says most people with this disorder develop multiple personalities, or alters, as a way to cope with trauma or abuse.
Whatever allows you to say, this did not happen to me, this is not going to happen to me again, I'm someone else.
And believe it or not, according to Kluft, multiple personalities often go unnoticed.
So do you think that there are, what, thousands of people walking around out there with MPD who don't even know it?
Oh, easily,
Tens of thousands?
easily,
Hundreds of thousands?
easily.
Millions?
We might be at that level.
But there are other therapists who say the number's not in the millions, but zero, that not even a single case of multiple personalities is real. The whole concept, not Sigmund Freud, but junk science.
I believe all MPD cases are artificial productions provoked by the attention doctors and others give them. All of them.
Dr. Paul McHugh is a professor and former head of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore.
People are persuaded that they have multiple personalities embedded within them and are encouraged to bring them out in the process of trying to get treatment for depression or anxiety or things of that sort.
If MPD is make-believe, you wouldn't expect to find it in a manual, the DSM-4, the Bible of mental health professionals used to diagnose mental disorders. Symptoms include the presence of 2 or more distinct identities or personality states. At least 2 of these recurrently take control of the person's behavior, plus an inability to recall important personal information. The DSM authors claim that as many as 1% of Americans have the disorder. But even that doesn't sway detractors, like Dr. Paul McHugh.
So wait, the DSM doesn't validate that a disease is actually out there?
Absolutely no. All it says is, this is what several people say exists, and this is what it looks like to them.
How many different personalities do you think you had?
Geez, I probably had a bunch of them.
Give me a number. Dozen?
Oh, yeah, I got a dozen.
At least a dozen.
Yes.
MPD is no fantasy to this former ballplayer, a Heisman Trophy winner, arguably one of the greatest running backs of all time. Walker, now a successful businessman, says he developed the disorder when he was a kid.
I had a stuttering problem, I had a speech problem. I couldn't put a sentence together.
And the kids teased you?
The kids teased me all the time.
And you think that abuse was severe enough that you started
Well,
developing
it
these
wasn't the
multiple
point that it was severe.
personalities?
It was severe enough.
He describes his alters in an autobiography. They don't have names, just titles, like the General, who tried to keep his alters in line, and the Warrior, a competitive personality who was uncontrollable, the one who made him play Russian roulette.
And I remember putting a bullet in a gun and spinning it, cylinder and putting it to my head and pulling it.
What do you think would have happened to you if you didn't get therapy?
Oh, I could have ended up in jail, dead, could have hurt someone.
You know there's a lot of debate about this.
Yes.
There are respected therapists out there who say...
Why are they respected? I'm being serious. Why are they respected?
By their peers, by,
Okay,
there
why
are
their
people who
peers
say...
respected? That's what I'm saying. These are doctors, but I'm the one that have been through it. They're very good at saying that, but I'm here to say, they didn't have to go through it.
But there are scores of patients who did go through it. Treatment, that is, who say their lives were ruined by therapists who convinced them they had a disorder that didn't exist. Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes spoke to one of them in 1997, Nadine Kuhl.
126 different personalities. What does that mean, Nadine?
It means that I had 126 different people
In you.
inside me.
And you believed in multiple personality disorder.
He taught me to believe in multiple
So you believed.
Yes.
She sued her psychiatrist, who settled the case for $2.3 million. Dr. Kluft closely watched that case and others where doctors paid big money.
Settling is not an admission of guilt. Settling is a way of ending a process in a way that's agreeable to the various parties.
I just have to say, as someone who's currently teaching psych and the law, I don't know that I buy that last bit. But I'm going to show you now the video from Three Faces of Eve. So this is not from the film. This is actually Eve herself, Chris Kostner-Sizemore. And you'll see her different personalities throughout this almost 5-minute video. So I'm going to go ahead and share that one. Maybe. That's cool. It just disappeared when I tried to share it. Gotta love that. All right, try the scan. Hey, there it is. Okay. Alrighty, here we go.
Are you feeling well these days?
Feel tired.
Feel tired? You felt tired for some little time, haven't you? I see. Do you hope and expect that this will all soon be terminated?
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
I think Jane would be the one.
You feel that she will be the one?
Yes.
How do you feel personally about it, though?
It's just something that's got to be.
Do you
I want to
feel...
get well, and if that's the only way to get well, that's the way I want it.
Do you feel that you will be in any part of it?
No, I don't feel that way.
Does it cause you distress?
In a way, I worry about Sarah.
You feel that she may not be taken care of?
Yes.
I see. Do you regret going, or what's your feeling about it?
No, I'm tired.
Could I speak with Eve Black now?
Sure.
Eve Black? How you feel?
Yeah, good.
Good. Why?
I don't know.
You
I
enjoyed-
always feel good.
Did you enjoy the trip over today?
Yeah. It was disappointing, though, wasn't it?
Was it?
Yeah, I thought we just zoomed through space and then we were just creeping along like a little caterpillar. I didn't even feel like I was moving.
That's your first airplane ride? How do you like all this?
I think it's real exciting.
Do you?
Don't you?
Yeah, it's very interesting.
I guess it is interesting in a way. I think it's more exciting than interesting.
How long have you been out?
Huh?
How long have you been out?
Do you mean in all?
Mm-hmm.
Off and on all my life.
All your life. You remember some things that happened in your childhood? You remember things that happened to Eve White?
I know everything that happened to her.
But you don't seem to have as much educational background. How is that?
I guess I just wasn't interested.
Why?
In getting an education, you have to study.
Well, somebody had to study.
Not really, no. She didn't have to.
Well, she did in order to get an education, didn't she?
She wanted one, though, but I didn't.
Why didn't you learn as she went along?
I guess I just didn't pay any attention.
Where were you when she studied?
I don't know. Just somewhere.
No, where? But you always knew what was going on. Did you have trouble coming out?
Yeah.
Could I speak with Eve White, please?
Sure.
Eve White? Feel all right? Could I speak with Jane? Jane?
It is real exciting, Dr. Dickman.
You enjoyed the trip over?
Yes, I do.
How do you feel about the future?
I'm optimistic.
Do you think that you will be the surviving one?
I think that's difficult to say right now.
Or do you feel hopeful?
Yes, I'd like to live.
What do you feel about the little girl?
Well, she seems like my own now. I've been around her quite a while.
You're rather looking forward to it?
Yes.
You don't mind the responsibilities, obligation to it? Do you have any sort of future plan for yourself?
At the present, no.
Alrighty, so there you could see different ways of talking. I mean, like Eve White is so quiet you can barely hear her, right? Whereas Eve Black and Jane both have more personality, but Eve Black is much more sort of like bubbly, enthusiastic. In the film, they sort of portray that they integrated the personalities into Jane. We're going to talk about that when we talk about therapy in a minute here. But and then they're like, and then they rode off into the sunset and everything's fine. But maybe not surprisingly, in reality, that didn't happen. And in fact, she had several recurrences of her multiple personalities throughout her life. And again, probably not surprising with something as severe as this. So I am now going to go ahead and reshare the PowerPoint. Okay. So the other dissociative disorder is depersonalization or derealization disorder. So this is, one thing I'll say before I get into this is that most people who are adults have experienced some symptoms of depersonalization or derealization at some point in their lives. Experiencing it once does not mean that you have this disorder. So I like to put that out there. So this used to just be called depersonalization disorder. And in the DSM-5, it categorizes depersonalization disorder as a dissociative disorder, but it's different in a lot of ways from the other dissociative disorders. The central system is persistent and recurrent episodes of depersonalization, which is a change in your experiences of yourself, where your mental functioning or body feels unreal or foreign. So typically when adults have experienced this, it's you're, really going, a couple all-nighters in a row, or you're just exhausted, or maybe on some sort of substance, right? And again, that does not make this disorder. This would be a circumstance where this is going to last for an extended period of time. So people with depersonalization disorder feel as if they've become separated from their body and observing themselves from the outside. And this sense of unreality can extend to other sensory experiences, mental operations, and behaviors as well. Depersonalization is often accompanied by derealization. Again, you can have one or the other, but oftentimes you experience both. And derealization is the feeling that the external world, too, is unreal, strange, or not connected to the world around you. And so you need one or both to meet the criteria for this disorder. Depersonalization symptoms alone do not indicate this disorder. So again, as I mentioned, transient feelings of depersonalization, derealization are fairly common. About half of adults have transient feelings of depersonalization or derealization at some point in their lives. I would guess it's even higher than that now, honestly. And the symptoms of this disorder, in contrast, are persistent or recurrent and cause marked distress and marked impairment in the person's social and occupational realms. This occurs most frequently in adolescents and young adults, and hardly ever in people older than 40. The disorder comes on suddenly and tends to be chaotic, or tends to be chronic. I mean, you feel chaotic, but it tends to be chronic. And relatively few theories have been offered as to explain this particular disorder, and there's little research that's been conducted on it. All right, so now we're going to go through and talk about how some of these models, theories we've been talking about this semester relate here. So how would the psychodynamic view explain dissociative disorders? So psychodynamic theorists believe that dissociative disorders are caused by repression, which is the most basic ego defense mechanism. And so the repression is essentially you kind of push something down mentally so it's out of sight, out of mind. And as you can imagine, this doesn't really work in the long term because eventually it's going to sort of bubble up to the surface. So people fight off anxiety by unconsciously repressing or preventing painful memories, thoughts, or impulses from reaching awareness. So in this view, dissociative amnesia and dissociative amnesia with dissociative fugue are single episodes of massive repression. Dissociative identity disorder is thought to result from a lifetime of excessive repression motivated by those very traumatic childhood events. And most of the support from this model is drawn from case history, which report brutal childhood experiences. But not all individuals with DID have had these particular experiences. And as I mentioned previously, child abuse itself is far more common than DID. So this can't be the only cause. So for example, Chris Sizemore, Eve, her trauma, she had like 3 things happen in fairly quick succession, but the most dramatic of those was she saw an industrial accident where a person had essentially been sawed in half. So that's traumatic, right? And that's problematic. But it's not sort of the repeated abuse that we typically associate with this. Now, the behavioral view here would argue that dissociation grows from normal memory processes and is a learned response through operant conditioning. So momentarily forgetting the trauma decreases your anxiety, and that increases the likelihood of future forgetting through the principles of negative reinforcement. You take away something that the person doesn't like, right? You don't like experiencing memories of your trauma, and then that is going to set you up to just forget more because it's reinforcing. Behavioral theorists see dissociation as escape behavior, just like people who are anxious use escape behavior to avoid their phobias or things along those lines. And like psychodynamic theorists, there are few disorders for which you'll hear me say that, but like behavioral and psychodynamic theorists believe the same thing, but this is a case of that. But they have to rely on case histories to support their view of dissociative disorders just because these are so rare. And while case histories support the behavioral model and also the psychodynamic model, right, they are also consistent with other explanations. And this is the problem with case studies, right, is that you can kind of explain them any way you want, depending on how you sort of spin how you tell it, right? So how do we treat these things? So let's start with dissociative amnesia and dissociative amnesia with dissociative fugue. The leading treatments for these disorders are psychodynamic therapy, hypnotic therapy, and drug therapy. So psychodynamic therapists, like any other disorder we'll talk about, ask patients to free associate and search their unconscious, try to get at why this is happening. In hypnotic therapy, patients are hypnotized and guided to recall forgotten events. This could potentially be problematic. There is some research about people being really vulnerable to suggestion under hypnosis. So they could remember something that's actually false, that never actually happened to them. So if, as a therapist, you're going to engage in this, you have to be very careful that you're not suggesting things. You would also use drug therapy, and in this particular case, you would use injections of barbiturates to help patients regain lost memories. So these are often called truth serums, and the key to the drug success is their ability to calm people and reduce their inhibitions. Okay, what about DID? So people with DID rarely recover without treatment. Again, remember, like dissociative amnesia, with or without fugue, they often just sort of spontaneously recover, right? That's not going to happen for someone with DID. So treatment for the disorder, like the disorder itself, is complex and difficult. And therapists try to help the client in several ways. The biggest way, as I mentioned when I was talking about Cameron West's experience, is recognizing that they have the disorder, admitting that this is happening, again, coming to terms with the fact that they're having a very unusual psychological experience. So once a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder has been made, therapists try to bond with the primary personality and with each subpersonality. As bonds are forged, therapists try to educate the patients and help them recognize the nature of this disorder. Some use hypnosis, or as I mentioned previously, video, as a means of presenting other subpersonalities. And some therapists recommend attending a DID support group if your area has enough DID people to have a support group. And so I have this sort of like goofy picture on here, and I know that these folks, psycho folks, have been to Wesleyan before. There are entertainment hypnotists, and they'll get people to do things like cluck like a chicken and things like that. And that is not what therapeutic hypnosis is like. So I always just like to put that out there. So you try to help the client recover memories. And again, just like with amnesia, we want to be really careful that we're not suggesting or planting things. So they may use any of the approaches we've already talked about, including hypnotherapy, using barbiturates. And these tend to work very slowly in cases of DID. They try to help the client by integrating the subpersonalities. The final goal of therapy is to, and this is one thing I'll say before I start talking about this in more detail. If you didn't catch my comments in the chat, this is what they were talking about in the Eve video, is the idea that there might only be one left because they're going to try to like integrate the personalities. So this is controversial within the therapy field. There are some therapists and definitely patients with DID who sort of believe this is akin to murder. It's like killing off parts of them. But there are others who think that this is really the ultimate way to treat this. So again, another spoilers for a decades-old movie, but there's a movie called Identity that stars John Cusack, and it's sort of like a murder mystery. And what you eventually find out is these people are actually alters inside his head, and the therapist is integrating the personalities. So again, sort of an interesting take on this. So if you are going to choose integration, the final goal of therapy is to merge the different subpersonalities into a single integrated entity. And this is a continuous process, and then fusion is the final merging. And many patients distrust this final treatment goal. And again, subpersonalities see integration as a form of death. And once the subpersonalities are merged, further therapy is needed to maintain the complete personality and to teach social and coping skills to prevent future dissociations. Because essentially what happens if you have any dissociative disorder, but particularly DID, in any sort of stressful situation, a different alter will come out to kind of handle it. So Cameron West has an alter, and I'm not remembering its name, but that is essentially like a shark in business. And so this personality comes out when he has to like close a business deal, and does a really good job. And so, you know, you might have something like that. Again, controversial. Some people question the need for full integration. And again, I just always feel like noting that some people think this doesn't exist at all. So that's an important point to note. All right, we're going to start briefly talking about somatoform disorders. So soma means body. And so these are disorders that you're overly preoccupied with your body in some way, your health in particular. But they have no identifiable medical condition causing the physical complications, or if there is a physical condition, it doesn't explain the extent to the symptoms. So like maybe you do have something small going on, but it doesn't explain why your symptoms are so severe or why they persist despite treatment. So here we have a physical illness or ailment that's explained largely by psychosocial causes, not medical causes. One thing to note here is that with the exception of one disorder we'll talk about, factitious disorder, these people are not purposely doing this. They are not trying to make themselves sick. Basically, their physiological symptoms are a manifestation of their psychological stress. Somatoform disorders are problems that appear to be physical or medical, but are due to psychosocial factors. And unlike psychophysiological disorders, in which psychosocial factors interact with physical factors to produce these genuine ailments and damage, these somatoform or somatic disorders are psychological disorders that masquerade as physical problems. So it's essentially your body is exhibiting the stress you don't know how to deal with otherwise. All right, so these disorders include factitious disorder, conversion disorder, somatic symptom disorder, and illness anxiety disorder. Now, body dysmorphic disorder used to be classified here. Now it's in the new obsessive compulsive and related disorders. But I'm still going to talk about it in this context. So we'll start with factitious disorders. And one thing I'll say before I even get too far into this is factitious disorders are purposely produced and do make me pretty upset. So just sort of heads up that especially factitious disorder imposed on someone else. And what I'm doing right now, sorry, is trying to find the video I want to show you. I didn't think I'd get this far today, but I'm being pretty efficient. So let me pop on YouTube and see if I can see it real quick. And if I can't, then I will find it for Thursday. So. Yeah, I'll find it for Thursday because it's really important to show. I think it's on one of my DVDs. So, so factitious disorders are where you are intentionally producing or feigning symptoms. People are faking pain or illness in order to be treated like a patient or have someone close to them be treated like a patient. And so this is again called a factitious disorder. It used to be called Munchausen syndrome. So this may be a term you're more familiar with. And they go to extreme lengths to create the appearance of illness. They can give themselves medications secretly. They can do things to themselves like inject drugs to cause bleeding, use laxatives to reduce chronic diarrhea. Some may undergo painful treatments and surgeries in order to fix this problem they're causing in themselves. And you might ask, well, why don't doctors catch this? Well, doctors don't want to assume this person is doing it to themselves, right? This is pretty darn rare. And so it can actually be pretty problematic in terms of trying to think of this in the context. Again, we don't want to be like, you're making this up when the person isn't and genuinely needs medical help. All right. So factitious disorder imposed on self, and again, this used to just be called Munchausen syndrome. And this is an extreme and chronic form of factitious disorder. And they induce symptoms on themselves, create illness in themselves. So it's deceptive falsification of physical or psychological symptoms. Now, I do like that they added this, because the next thing we're going to talk about is fictitious disorder imposed on another, or what used to be called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And I had a friend in grad school who saw 2 kids that she believed had Munchausen by proxy for psychological symptoms. Basically, they were only depressed when their caregiver was around. When she wasn't around, the kids seemed fine, right? At that time, it was really hard to diagnose it for psychological symptoms. So I like that they included this piece of it, right? Or they can deceptively produce injury in themselves or disease, even in the absence of external reward. So they're not just doing it to try to get like workman's comp or something like that, or disability. So they present themselves as injured, ill, impaired. And the reasons for this, kind of up in the air, but it seems like there's something about being in that patient role that is in and of itself reinforcing to these individuals. So fictitious disorder imposed on another is the one that ticks me off so much. Anytime you do anything to a kid, it really makes me upset. And I've been that way since before I had my daughter. I have treated a fair number of people who have been abused as children, either because they developed an eating disorder as a result of their abuse and an unhealthy relationship with their body because of it. They were depressed, anxious, PTSD, what have you. And so it just makes me so mad when someone abuses someone who doesn't have the power to stand up for themselves, like a kid. But here, parents make up or produce physical illness in their children. It can be someone else who you're in a position of power over, but typically it's kids. They may give them medications or poisons in order to make them ill. So again, spoilers for a decades-old movie. If anyone's seen the movie The Sixth Sense, near the end, Haley Joel Osment's character goes and talks to the ghost of a young girl whose mother did this to her, was poisoning her. And children may have to undergo painful diagnostic tests, medications, multiple surgeries. This is considered by law enforcement to be a type of child abuse, not surprisingly, right? And so it's the deceptive falsification of physical or psychological symptoms. Again, remember the psychological is a key addition here. And it's deceptive production of injury or disease in another person. And again, even in the absence of external rewards, and you present the victim, that other person that you're doing this to, as ill, impaired, or injured. Here's my slide for Munchausen by proxy. So this is considered by law enforcement to be a form of child abuse. And the biggest tell here is that when you take kids away from the parent, their symptoms disappear. So again, that's super clear, right? So what kind of parent would do this to their child, right? Like, this is so upsetting to think about. It's usually someone who's very needy. They like attention and praise they get from serving in this sort of heroic role of caring for a sick child. They're often very intelligent. They may have a medical background. So they may have worked in a doctor's office, like as a receptionist, or done medical transcription, or even be a nurse. And they usually deny their actions, even in the face of clear evidence. And they tend to refuse treatment. And when they are treated, it's largely unsuccessful. Like, if for some reason they just think that this is fine, they deny that they're doing anything, it's very, very disheartening. So these disorders seem to be most common among people with one or more of these particular factors. So as a kid, they themselves experienced extensive medical treatment. They may have had family problems or experienced physical or emotional abuse as a child themselves. Sometimes they carry a grudge against the medical profession. And they have, again, worked often in some sort of medical position. So a medical aide, a nurse, a lab tech. And often they have underlying personality problems like extreme dependence. At the end of the semester, we'll talk about dependent personality disorder, and they could certainly have features of that, if not be fully diagnosable with that. So the precise causes of factitious disorder are not understood, although clinical reports have pointed to factors such as depression, unsupportive parental relationships during childhood, and an extreme need for social support. And clinicians have been unable to develop dependably effective treatments for this disorder. To be perfectly honest, oftentimes these parents will end up in prison, right, because of child abuse. These tend to be rare but high-profile cases. So certainly something that, but you have to catch them, right? And it can take years and years to catch them. So again, very disheartening, very overwhelming. And we have about 4 minutes left. So let me see real quick if I can find this video to show you all. If I can't, then like I said, I'll just pull it up on Thursday. But I think it might be, yep, on one of these. So now comes the big question of, will my computer communicate with my external CD drive? I know it's dated because not many people use physical media anymore, but I wish they were still integrated, just because there are so many cases you have to use physical media because it's just not available digitally. So give this a whirl, cross our fingers. Just waiting for it to pop up. Trying to open the program. Again, we'll see if this works. Looks like it's a no-go. Oh, nope, here we go. But it's not recognizing the disk. Ooh, so helpful. Okay, so I will get this going for, actually, let me try one more thing here. See if Windows Media Player will open it. Yep, okay. Oh, okay. I'm going to screen share real quick here. And this is a short clip, so we can watch the whole thing here. Oh, no, I need a new extension to play this. Cool. All right. Sorry. This is me trying to be like, yeah, we'll get through everything. But clearly we're not going to. So, like I said, we'll watch this at the beginning of class on Thursday because it is a sad but a really informative clip about what this could look like. A case where a young girl was a victim of uncharged by proxy. So I will see you all Thursday. I'll do my normal thing where I stick around for a minute or three in case anyone has any questions. And if not, I'll see you Thursday morning.